Autowerke came from King's Auto, and today we're working on two F80 M3 CSs. The one behind me is getting H&R lowering springs, wheel spacers, and we're actually gonna take the Active Autowerke mid-pipe off the one over there and putting it on this one. That one, we're gonna be replacing the Active Autowerke mid with an exhaust from AWE. It's basically just straight pipe all the way from the downpipe to the rear. And to finish off this exhaust, we actually have these nice ceramic coated exhaust tips. All right, so we're gonna get started with this one first. Especially on these cars, when taking off the wheels, I know a lot of people like to go straight to impacting them, but for these, since these lug nuts are usually black, we always crack them loose with the breaker bar first, and at the end we'll torque them back down. The goal is to never really impact on these. Be careful going around the spokes of the wheels, get them a little loose, and that's all we really need. To start with the front lowering springs, we're just gonna unhook a bunch of these wires that are clipped in, because the end goal is to pull the strut out of this housing a little, so we don't want to be tugging on wires and creating internal breakages. You'll start throwing ABS lights, brake pad wear sensor lights if you accidentally tug on one of these. Really simple. You just start unclipping them out. You don't got to take the whole thing out. After that, we're going to disconnect the sway bar link. Should be a 16mm nut. Usually the back joint will want to spin with you. It should be a T30 that goes to the center of it, but we got lucky this case. The nut came right off. After disconnecting all the sensors and the sway bar link, we're also going to disconnect the tie rod end. It's a 21 mil. The point of this is to give us more flex for the whole knuckle assembly to drop down. So at this point, we're gonna drop the car back down, loosen the center nut of the strut mount. We're just gonna use a floor jack to support the weight of the front knuckle. I usually just like to go on the center control arm. It's right in the center of the knuckle. You might touch the brake shield a little, but it's okay, because that can always just be flexed back at the end. On the top, we're gonna start disconnecting the EDC sensor, and then we're gonna get a panel popper tool and just pop these off so we can expose the top of the strut mount. We're just gonna pop the top of this off. There's a little sensor, it just pulls straight up. And you get this little doohickey. The top of the strut mount nut is going to be an 18mm 12 point. We have sort of like a pass-through socket going on over here. This basically just helps us to counter hold it, because the center of the strut will actually spin with us if you don't. And then you're just going to do an infinite spin. So once we got the top nut of the strut mount out, we're just going to lower the knuckle assembly. And it should come down enough for us to take the whole assembly outwards. Just be careful of the fenders. Always a good idea to throw some painter's tape over it just in case. We're going to take out the strut bellow and the bump stop. Put the whole spring. Set that aside. There we go. We have one of the front springs out. We're just going to clean off the bottom of the spring purchase. Once we got the spring into the lower perch and all lined up, we're gonna throw the bump stop and the bellow back in. Now on the bellow, there is an alignment spot for the spring, so just make sure you're in alignment up top, and you're also in alignment down low. Throughout the whole process, just repeatedly check it. As you're moving stuff around, you might get displaced, so you just wanna make sure you're all lined up. If you're not lined up, your alignment will probably get a little messed up. Okay, so now once you got the strut through the center of the mount, we're just gonna recheck all our alignment marks, and we are good to go. Once you have the strut all the way through, we'll tighten down the center nut. After we got the top nut of the strut mount in, we're just gonna start hooking these sensors back up. We're gonna throw the tie rod back in. So after you get the tie rod back on, we'll throw the sway bar link back in, and then we'll be ready for the wheel. We'll check everything manually. Before throwing the wheel on, we're just going to throw some grease over the hub. They usually like to corrode a little. To finish up the spring job, we're going to be throwing on some future classic wheel spacers. We're going to run 12mm in the front and 15mm in the rear. Prior to installing spacers, corrosion tends to build up on the hub. We're just going to hit it with a wood wheel real quick. A wire wheel, clean it up, throw some more grease over it. Then we'll be ready for the spacers. Future Classic spacers are going to be a little different than what people typically use. You're going to have to take out these screws, and they actually supply you with new ones to hold them to the hub. Usually with other brands like Burger, you can just slap them on, they're press fit. You could honestly, if these rotor screws are a little stuck, you probably don't have to run the screws because unless you might strip them out. These are press fit, and once you tighten the wheel, they go right over it. This is just so that when you're aligning the holes, the spacer's not going to spin with you, and now you're like off alignment. Just gonna wedge up the rotor. After we get the wheel mounted, this front is all done. Right now we just have it hand tie in. Once we drop it down to the ground, we'll do the final torquing just to keep the black coating on these nice and pretty. Now we're gonna move to the rear. The rears are pretty straightforward. All we really have to do is just drop the control arm, not even fully. We'll drop it enough to be able to pull it down, disconnect the headlight leveling sensor, and slide the spring in. And that's pretty much it. Compared to the fronts, the rears are super easy. Probably like 10-15 minutes tops if everything's cooperating, which usually on a newer, nice car like these, you're really not gonna have any trouble with the bolts. To start with the rears, we're just gonna mark our eccentrics over here so we get put back in the same spot. Alternatively, if you really don't want to mess with the alignment, you could probably take out this and this. I just find it hard to pry it this way and take the spring out. So I usually do like to take out the eccentrics, and you put it back the same way. The alignment is usually untouched. For the eccentrics, we're gonna have 221s. You're gonna turn the nut of the eccentric and not the bolt. Once you loosen that up, just gonna flip this over. We're just gonna give it a quick tap. Should drop right out. After that, we're gonna get the screw jack under the control arm assembly so we can start taking out the shock. After we take out the shock hardware, we're gonna undo the headlight sensor so that we have enough space to flex it down without breaking it. We're gonna take out the headlight leveling sensor right now, just a 10mm. After that, we're gonna undo the lower nut and bolt for the rear shocks, and the 18s on both sides. After that, we can slowly release the tension on the spring, pull down the lower control arm, take out the spring. We got the lowering spring here. Just make sure your isolators are all in the proper positions. The top one's got a groove for the spring. Then we'll get this back in. Now there is an alignment dowel for the lower isolator. It's gonna be hard to miss, but I'll show you once this is in. So the lower isolator is gonna have this little sharp dowel. Just make sure that aligns up into the control arm. Once all your mounts are lined up, just make sure your positions haven't shifted inside the purchase. And then we're gonna start raising the whole assembly back up, and then we're done with the rear. Once we line up the hole, we're gonna throw in the lower nut and bolt for the rear shock. Won't tighten that down just yet. We're gonna try to line up the eccentric bolt. We're gonna throw in the rear eccentric bolt now. You can just slide it through. The marks aren't gonna line up just yet, but once we get it in, we can turn it. Throw on the rear nut and washer. We're just gonna hook up the headlight leveling sensor, throw it on over it, tighten it down, and then we'll start preloading the rear. Make sure you always preload when you're working with suspension components, just so you don't shorten the life of the bushings. The whole purpose of preloading is basically just, try to simulate the car as if it was on the ground before tightening everything down. Actually changes the base positioning of this bushing. If you don't preload, you'll be running this bushing at a much higher tension than it's supposed to be, and that will contribute to it wearing out prematurely. Line up the eccentric. You can actually see the alignment of the whole suspension changing as you rotate this. Now we got this F80 lifted up in the air, we're going to be uninstalling this Active Autowerke mid-pipe. It joins to the stock muffler at this section, runs all the way up to the downpipe. We're going to be taking this off and transplanting it onto the other F80. The two hangers are going to be 13mm nuts. These are 15mm nuts. Hope they don't fucking break, because that would suck ass. Oh shit, this was good.
Nice!
Got two E-Torques, should be E10s. Yep. These 4 bolts up here, we got two 13 mils and two 11 mils. So once we got all the hardware out, we should be ready to drop the whole thing. Just gotta slide it back. On the stock one, we already made the cuts for the Active Autowerke. It's anywhere from like 1.5 to 2 inches from the tip. You can always make the cut longer if you're worried, and then adjust down as you go. Just using a screw jack to support the weight of the entire mid-pipe. And once we're ready to drop it, we can take out the screw jack. Alright, you're out. Alright, so just slide it through the pegs. And then we'll get the screw jack up and we'll be good.
Yep, we're in.
It's normal to have a little gap when you're doing these active ones. The gasket isn't going to go all the way in, but the good thing about these gaskets is they crush to form the seal, so you're not going to get any leaks from here. So as you're tightening down, you're worried about this, you really don't have to. We got a couple places where the exhaust is hitting the heat shield. We already bent one spot over here. And then closer up front, we got another spot. So we're just gonna see what we can do about that. Just get a little pry bar, massage the heat shield back in. Might not have too much room to play with on this. Like you, I said that.
Like, happy with it?
I love it. So you might probably run it like a rear finish.
I like the inner look to it. Unless he doesn't want it. You want to go one more space in the front?
So here we just finished up Gio's car. We got the lowering springs done. Fitment's pretty good. We got 15s in the rear. Balls in the front, Active Autowerke mid-pipe installed. Sounds pretty good. We also disconnected the valves in the muffler actually, so they're just constantly open. Ride height looks good, the spacing looks good. So we'll stay tuned for the next updates. telling you, Louis did the same shit except way fucking worse, bro.